The Guam Legislature is back in session. We're still on Bill 154. I believe we left off with Senator Tom Atta. Did you have the floor with an amendment? Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment that I was going to make was basically to ensure that these utility vehicles, which really are not designed for travel on your, for normal travel on your routed highways, which have speed limits of up to 35 miles an hour, is to ensure, the amendment that I want to make then is to ensure that if these vehicles are going to be anywhere on that routed road, it is really for the purpose of crossing that routed road to get from one secondary road within the village, for example, to cross to get to the other side of the village to another secondary road. And so the amendment that I would proffer is would be on page 2. On line 21, and where it ends with, in accordance with Guam law, period, that would read, in accordance with Guam law, provided that the motorized vehicle, utility vehicle, may operate on routed roadways for the purpose of crossing to get from one non-routed roadway to another. And so that actually would be the first amendment to that section 2 with regards to the presence of these utility vehicles on routed roads. And so everybody should have a copy of this amendment sheet.
On the first added amendment, any objection or anyone wish to be heard on it? Oh, Senator Pangilinan.
I believe they were, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly rise in support of this amendment. I think it answers the age-old question of why did the mule cross the road? To get to the other side, to service the other constituents. Now, once we get to the question of why did the chicken cross the road, I don't know what that answer is yet, and I'm looking for the amendment that will resolve that issue. But again, it's because the way our villages are situated, they're not laid out all nicely, and I think that the intent of the mayors utilizing these mules, commonly called mules, is to allow them to service and go through the villages while being a bit more efficient with regards to these mules can carry items, can ferry passengers, very, very fuel efficient. And this is one of the things that many of the mayors had talked about in the past was, trying to buy these machines or these vehicles so that they can just be efficient and effective. And I think that realizing the way that our villages are situated, allowing them to traverse incidental traffic on these routed roads for the purpose of accessing the other parts of the village to service the constituent certainly makes sense. And I thank the author for the amendment and certainly support it. Thank you, and Mrs. Masit.
Thank you very much. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Your second amendment, Senator Atta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The second amendment is also on this same amendment sheet, and it is on page 2 at the end of line 25. Therein, it gives a description of what this motorized utility vehicle is. And I think that we need to add an additional specification as to what this motorized utility vehicle. So as written right now, a utility vehicle is 63 inches or less in width. It has a weight of 1,850 pounds, travels on less than 6 wheels, and the amendment I would like to make, and can travel up to maximum speeds of 20 miles per hour. Now, some have said, well, why not 25? Why not 35? I got the 20 mile per hour specification from another legislation that has been enacted elsewhere, and they basically have defined the utility vehicle as having an engine that would only take it up to a maximum of 20 miles per hour unless it's going downhill and it gets a running start.
On this other amendment, any senator wish to be heard on it? Any objection to the other amendment? Any other senator wish to be heard on the bill 154 on the main motion? Senator Tommy Morrison. After Senator Morrison, any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? Senator Morrison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the bill, and I commend the author for her effort in working with the mayors to provide them some opportunity to be much more efficient with a specific utility vehicle that, as the previous speaker mentioned about the design or the makeup of our villages and some of the roads that they have to assess or get into, and not even a regular pickup truck can get into some of these roads. So I commend the author for making it much more efficient for our mayors. So we know that they are out there currently with these utility vehicles, but it of course makes it a bit challenging trying to assess other areas because the lack of authority to be on the main roadways. However, Mr. Speaker, I do want to ensure that not everybody is allowed to do this with a utility vehicle or a mill, and to ensure that this is specific to the mayor of that municipality or the utility vehicle. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to proffer an amendment on page 2, line 17. And insert the following word, the roadways. It says, comma, so long as said vehicles are permanently marked with the mayor's official logo of that municipality, comma.
On the Morrison amendment, Senator Uggan, you wish to be heard? Okay. No objection. Thank you, Senator Morrison. Senator Uggan, on the main motion.
Buenas, Mr. Speaker. That's Idris Masi. Good morning to our fellow colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to stand in support of this legislation and, just share perhaps a glimpse of a personal situation where last week, about Monday or Tuesday, I was driving through just in front of St. Francis Church in Jonia. And the Jonia Mayor's mule, and I'll call it the Jonia Mayor's office mule, was crossing the main highway. And I glanced over at that vehicle, and it reminded me of this particular legislation and when, in fact, we had it in the public hearing. And in that case, if a legislation or a law such as this was not in place, then GPD has every right to cite that particular vehicle. So I think that this would address that concern because obviously at least from my perspective, the mayor's office was traversing or crossing over the main highway, Route 4, to go over to the baseball field to be able to take care of some of their maintenance and upkeep of that facility. So this legislation would address that. I just want to also recognize and thank the mayors for bringing this forward because obviously situations such as this in terms of authorizing the appropriate vehicles to traverse over our roadways and our highways, it's important that we all comply with the law. And in this case, the mayors recognized an issue, recognized a concern, and brought it to the attention of this body so that the appropriate legislation can be enacted. Also, Mr. Speaker, during the course of the public hearing, we had heard that there have been a few warnings extended by the Guam Police Department officers to some of the mayor's staff, informing them that as they traverse through the main roadways, that their mules, because they were unregistered and unlicensed, that they could literally be cited. It was an issue that was brought to the attention of some of the mayors. But I bring this up because I want to also lean forward and thank the police officers for extending that warning to the mayors, because otherwise they could have cited the mayor's staff or the mayor's office in regards to not complying with the law, but they yielded a warning in anticipation of this legislation passing through. So to our officers out there who worked and partnered with our mayors and notifying and warning their staff members that using the mules and some of these vehicles to cross some of the roadways certainly was not appropriate and was not in compliance with the existing law is one of the reasons why we're here discussing this particular measure. So, Mr. Speaker, in that light, thanks to the mayors for all of their efforts and what they continue to do and the services they provide our community, and for bringing this to the attention of the oversight chair, and then also to our police officers who have yielded significant, flexibility in terms of working with the mayor's staff, and not only extending the warning, but notifying them that the law has to be amended. So I want to just make those comments, and I stand in support of this particular legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Senator Ada?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to point out that really the objective of Bill 154 was twofold. One was to not require the mayor's offices to register the vehicles, and as I understand it, because of the fees. I mean, that's just an additional drain on their budget. And secondly was to be able to authorize these vehicles to be on routed roads and to be operated on the public roads. I think we've addressed the second objective in terms of operating within the secondary roads, crossing routed roads, etc. But we have not addressed the issue of the registration requirements. In our discussion last week, it was suggested that the registration requirements really should be maintained. It is the one way that the government is able to maintain an inventory of what equipment belongs to the government that's out there, in this case belonging to the mayor's offices. And so in that regard then, I would like to make an amendment to the bill to require that these utility vehicles be registered, but that the registration fees for these vehicles be waived. And that would then address the concerns of the mayors from the standpoint of they have a small budget to begin with, and by waiving the fees, then they're able to comply with the law without that drain on their budget. So the amendment then that I would like to proffer is on page 2, line 16, to strike the word unregistered, so that it reads that mayors, vice mayors, and or their respective staff may operate motorized utility vehicles. And it reads so on and so on with all the amendments that we've made. And then on line 25, then, the second part to that amendment would be to add a new sentence at the end to read, the registration fee of subject utility vehicles, comma, that are the property of the mayoral offices, comma, shall be waived, period.
Does everybody understand that amendment? Anyone wish to be heard? Senator Limtiaco, was your hand going up? Hearing no, Senator Uggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly applaud the mover of the amendment, and I support the amendment. Perhaps the only issue that we may want to move in the direction of is allowing the mayor's offices to be able to register all their vehicles / inclusive of the subject that we're discussing, perhaps simultaneously at one time. And this is a different matter, Mr. Speaker, but I've been through the line on 5 separate occasions every single year. And obviously because of the number of vehicles I own. And I think that it'll only be appropriate, and perhaps this is a thought that may be directed towards the oversight chair, to allow the mayors to be able to register their vehicles on an annual basis on a particular time, to register all of them, all inclusive. Because if a mayor's office has, let's say, 3 or 4 mules and 4 or 5 other vehicles that are all being registered at 5 or 6 different timelines, it takes up a lot of time of their personnel. And I wanted to bring this up as an issue and as a concern, because it does remove some of their staff from otherwise providing the direct support to the community. But that is just a thought in line with the registration component of the proposed amendment. But I support the amendment, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? On the main motion, any other senator wish to be heard? If not, I invite the sponsor to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleagues who've shared their inputs and made the necessary amendments to strengthen and make this a better bill. I'd like to add, for the record, if we can add to the co-sponsorships, Senator Tom Atta, Senator Tommy Morrison, Senator Frank Uggan, and Speaker Pangilinan as co-sponsors, and then ask to move it to the voting file.
On the co-sponsorship, hearing no objection, ongoing, sending it down. Next bill was 156. The speaker's out. 157. No. I'm going to move forward. 157, Senator Atta.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask that we pass that. And we'll come back to it later.
158, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 158 is a bill that is intended to create a mandate for us to kind of catch up our government with the technologies that are available for operations today. Throughout the course of our government's history, we've established multiple fees and charges to the people of Guam, to the communities we serve. And these fees and charges were created so that the government can operate.
Is there a substitute? Which one are we moving on?
We can go ahead and move on the original, Mr. Speaker, and I'll just make an amendment on some.
All right. On the motion to place 158 in the second reading with the opportunity to, in third reading with the opportunity to speak, hearing no objection. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So what the bill will intend to do is to bring us up to the technological age and have all of our agencies review all of their fees and charges and determine whether or not they can actually be put online. We recently enacted, through the hard work of Senator Morrison, an Office of Technology, and now I believe it's time for us to begin implementing mandates that would help to focus the mission of that office with respect to the overall government operations and bringing as much of our services online as possible. What this bill will do is it will require all of the agencies and instrumentalities of the government to look at every single fee that they assess and determine whether or not it is plausible or implausible to place those fees online. I do have an amendment I'd like to proffer at this time, Mr. Speaker. It's a technical amendment.
Please.
For page 2 and 3, everywhere that it reads Bureau of Information Technology, I would like that to be changed to Office of Technology.
On that technical amendment, no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so with this bill, if it passes and gets signed into law, every agency will look at all of its fee structure and figure out, can we put this online or not? And if they can, then they'll send that report to the Office of Technology. And if they can't, they'll need to come up with the reasons why, because it's important that we understand what may be holding us back from putting as many of these fees and charges online. And so this will require the agencies to identify the fees and charges and work with the Office of Technology so that we can figure out how much is it going to cost to actually transition as many of these fees and charges as possible onto an online platform. And the reason why getting it online will be very beneficial, Mr. Speaker, is multifaceted. First and foremost, the more transactions we can have done online, the less we need to have our people driving everywhere to go and get these things paid for and filed. The less driving we have, the less congested our roadways are. The more online transactions our people are able to do, the more time they save time and reduce congestion on our roadways, has economic benefits that transcend being able to just measure it on a dollar-for-dollar basis. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, by having fees and charges online, we can create the support mechanisms in the technology to be able to track these things and account for them on a much more accurate basis. So instead of having things done manually and then receipts being paid out manually and then somebody having to go and input that into some other spreadsheet in order to track or record the transaction, having them online will allow for so much more automation in our government. And in the end, automation is a key component of increased efficiency. So I would like for my colleagues to please help me refine this if they believe that there's any amendments that could be made to improve it, and to help along this process of bringing as much of our fees and charges onto an online platform as possible. And this bill will help us to determine not only what we can put online, but what it's going to cost for us to be able to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I have Senator Uggan, Senator Morrison. Any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? Senator Uggan, you recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to stand in support of the proposed measure. You know, it's very refreshing, Mr. Speaker, when we entertain legislation that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes people refer to that as common sense, so to speak, legislation in terms of why is it that we haven't done this to date. And that's why I stand in full support of this, and I commend the sponsor for having the foresight and the recognition that moving in this direction is the most appropriate approach for government services. You know, when we look at government services, we try to look at efficiencies, we try to look at effectiveness, we try to ensure that whatever services are being provided, that to the greatest extent possible, that the customers, in this case the people of Guam, have the best opportunity to be able to render their payments if it's appropriate, and to go through the use of technology. And in this case, in today's world, obviously it's the use of the computer system. I want to also, Mr. Speaker, highlight that the third co-equal branch of government, which is the judiciary of Guam, just very recently implemented across the board the payment, the authorization, and the ability for many of their clients and their customers to be able to pay directly online. It did cost a little in terms of implementing that program, but I understand that it's working extremely well for the judiciary of Guam in terms of receiving the appropriate payments that have been rendered by the courts. And just looking at that as an example, certainly kudos to the judiciary, but applying that very same concept across the board to the entire government of Guam makes a lot of sense. I want to also highlight, Mr. Speaker, that in many cases, the agencies themselves, perhaps with the exception of Revenue Tax, which has a very high volume of customers visiting that facility, many agencies could also apply an indirect approach in terms of receiving payments, and that is to go to the respective agencies, in this case the Department of Administration, that already has a mechanism in place to be able to most likely receive direct payments through the internet or through the website, and perhaps partner with that government agency so that they can, rather than reinventing the wheel or creating a whole new system, just provide direct notification that this is the outstanding balance, be able to link some of their computer systems to that agency so that payments can be made through that route, rather than creating perhaps individualized systems within some of these government agencies, especially those that do not have a high volume of traffic coming through their doors. So, Mr. Speaker, I stand in support of this particular measure. I think it's has a lot of foresight on the part of the sponsor of the legislation, and I certainly hope that the implementation of this particular proposal or this concept will take effect as quickly as possible so that it would ultimately benefit the customer base out there of these respective agencies, and in this case, it's the people of Guam. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator Agnew. Senator Morrison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly rise in support of Bill 158. As the author of Public Law 32-10, that established the Office of Technology, I commend the author for his good work on this and focusing this effort on e-government, trying to advance our government IT services. As everyone knows, e-government or e-government is a major initiative and a passion of mine, and over the weekend I read an article in PDN that Reverend Tax is looking to offer these payments online. While I commend the director for going down this road, it's not the first time, Mr. Chair or Mr. Speaker, that they have offered this. If you go to payguam.gov, it was to go effective on April of 2012. It's already going on 2 years, and if you click on that, it shows error. So we're hoping they will get online. I'm optimistic, Mr. Speaker, but this is why the body about 9 months ago established the Office of Technology. This is an 800 to maybe someone can correct me, to $1 billion operation at the government of Guam, and we don't have a dedicated IT office. I just went on some tours of the recent PFC building and saw a whole floor in that building dedicated to IT. While our government, well, although we just recently stood up the Office of Technology and hope it will evolve over time to an operation by far that would transform this government, we see this happening in the private sector. We see this happening in corporations, that they're dedicating their primary focus to advancing IT so they can transform their services as well. So I'm sure this is happening throughout many other corporations as well, but going back to the bill, Mr. Speaker, we all wanted to establish this Office of Technology for this purpose, to ensure that the continuity of these services is paramount. Again, we saw this go online several years back. Then of course, it's not there anymore. Bill 158 achieves a very critical objective, and that is to ensure that these services, of course, look at the plausible and implausible options of seeing how we could bring these services online and ensure that we can come back as a body and look at what appropriations may be needed to ensure that these services are supported. But importantly, Mr. Speaker, there should be no reason why Revenue Tax, DOA, BBMR, most of these line agencies should be making IT their primary focus as we establish the Office of Technology to ensure that their continuity of these services are paramount, and that we don't go online one day and the next day it's offline. this is critical to ensuring that we provide the services to our customers, to our businesses. As the authors mentioned earlier, is time is money to many of our people today, and they can do most of this in today's information age. Most of these business transactions or services can be put online. So, Mr. Speaker, I certainly rise in support of this bill, and I thank my colleague, the author of this bill, for his efforts and making this movement of e-government a passion of his as well. And I look forward to supporting this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator Morrison. Any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? If not, I invite the sponsor to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the most rewarding aspects of being just one member in a 15-member body is the ability for us to focus our work and also to help improve and grow and expand the good work that we do for the people of Guam. The Office of Technology was a really, really important and critical step forward in getting our government to be able to hone in on taking advantage of the technological opportunities that will allow us to expand and improve our services. This bill is just a component part of a greater body of work that all 15 members of this legislature was able to establish months ago, and now we're able to start moving individual focus items forward such as this. And I'm very glad to be a part of this body. It really honors me, and it's really a great experience to be able to work with a great team like this. I would like to make an amendment, Mr. Speaker, to add Senator Frank Uggan and Senator Tommy Morrison as co-sponsors, and thereafter proceed to move this down to third reading file. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to add the co-sponsors, hearing no objection. On the motion to send it down. I understand that the committee report has just been submitted for 160, but it's not up yet. So if it's okay, Senator Rodriguez, I'll just go down to Senator Ben, and then we'll come back to yours in a second after we get it up. I get notification that it's up. Senator Ben, 162.
Thank you, and Mananas Idus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move that Bill 162-32 LS be placed in the third reading file, and I'd like to explain the bill very briefly.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bill 162 seeks to just correct a technical error that was found in an earlier bill that was passed by the Guam Legislature. That earlier bill was a bill that established collective investment funds and the authority of banks and pension fund managers to form these funds on Guam, keep the investments on Guam rather than sending them off island. When we went through the bill, we of course had to make it consistent and wanted to make it consistent with federal regulations. And the citation that was placed in the original bill was 15 U.S.C. Section 80C 10B. And when we were getting ready to, the bill was signed by the governor, reviewed by his legal staff, and unfortunately, even they missed the citation. And so when the industry was getting ready to implement it and set these funds up and get their brochures approved, they noticed that there was an error in the citation of the appropriate federal legislation. And so this would strike out what was in the bill and replace it with 15 U.S.C. Section 80A-3, parenthesis C, parenthesis 11. And really, this was just a technical error that unfortunately neither I nor my committee was able to catch, or the governor's legal review team was able to catch until it was time to implement it. And then we caught it, and of course, we're just correcting that mistake.
Any senator wish to be heard on the main amendment? On the bill? Any objection, Senator? There are no senators that wish to speak. You may close or just send it down. On the motion to send the bill down, Senator Rodriguez, Bill 165.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to place Bill 165 on the third reading and briefly be able to explain what it is.
On that motion, hearing no objection.
And that is as substituted. Mr. Speaker.
On the bill as substituted.
Yes, 165. Pursuant to Public Law 31-141, the Department of Public Health and Social Services promulgated the Government of Guam healthy vending machine rules and regulations relative to the sale of snacks and beverages from vending machines located in all Gov Guam premises. At the time Public Law 31-141 was enacted, the legislature decided that the Government of Guam should lead by example and took the steps of initiating a public policy encouraging and promoting the consumption of healthy foods and snacks obtained from vending machines on government property. In this regard, and to its credit, Public Health has already initiated its own policy, which has proven successful. Our adoption of these rules and regulations further supports the practice of eating healthy, which steadily is becoming the norm, not the exception. Hopefully, with us leading by example, the private sector will follow soon. During the public hearing on Bill 165, the issue was again raised that the mobile food service establishment, also known as canteens, as well as other food and beverage vendor activities in either temporary or permanent fixed structures, should likewise be included so as to comply with the spirit and intent of the healthy vending machine provisions, at least to the limited extent provided in this bill. The bill does, however, duly recognize that this is a different situation and that a somewhat varied approach must be taken in the promotion of the sale of healthy foods from this category of food and beverage vendor. The bill is also careful not to unduly impede the conduct of temporary activities, such as the short-term food and beverage activities which are licensed or permitted to operate during special events hosted or sponsored by the Mayor's Council, or other authorized nonprofit organizations during their different village events. The responsibility of implementing the provisions of this act is to be shared between the Department of Administration, which is generally tasked with procurement, in conjunction with the Department of Public Health and Social Services, which is better suited in determination of what constitutes healthy food and beverage products. And so, Mr. Speaker, what this really does is just adopt the rules and regs that the public health, the professionals, the healthcare professionals have put together. And when we first passed Public Law 31-141, we were very careful to ensure that this is a requirement that we are imposing on the government, on us, and not saying that if you are Home Depot, you are Kmart, that you have a vending machine there, you got to have it a healthy vending machine. We want to make sure that we do, we clean our own house first and make sure that we lead by example. And a lot of the NCDs, and Mr. Speaker, you're very passionate and very involved in a lot of the work that public health does, especially with the consortium, with the NCD consortium. And we know that a lot has to do with our eating habits, the lifestyles we have. And the only way to really combat this problem and the problem of the rising cost of healthcare is to change the way we live our lives and encouraging that way, because I'm for one, not going to force people to change their lifestyle or to change what they eat, but we need to encourage them, especially our young kids. And so hopefully with the passage of this law, we'll start to see that when you enter GMH, for example, and every floor has a vending machine there, we'll start to see that these vending machines are offering healthier snacks and beverages, and hopefully that would, in the future, change the way our healthcare is on Guam. So I ask for my colleagues' support in implementing these rules and regs that was put together by the professionals. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
On the bill, any senator wish to be heard on 165? Any senator wish to be heard on Bill 165? Seeing none, Senator Rodriguez. On the motion to send the bill down. Senator Pangilinan on Bill 170.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move that Bill 170-3215 or LS, be placed in the third reading file, and I'd like to discuss the bill briefly.
On that motion,
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bill 170-32 is a bill that was worked on by the Retirement Fund in our office and their investment consultants. As you know, the Retirement Fund's investment criteria for the defined benefit plan is actually set in statute. Unlike the defined contribution plan, the defined benefit plan, of course, as you know, its main feature is guaranteed pension for life. And the formation and enactment of the defined benefit plan was done through legislation. And over the years, as we've changed the character of the retirement fund in terms of benefits as well as contributions, investment criteria, guidelines, rather than making those changes through what you would normally do in terms of pension programs, what you would call the plan document, because we started out with law, we've always amended the law. Unlike the defined contribution plan, in which we started out with law, and then we had the plan document, and then changes that are available to be made to the plan document or to the plan itself under defined contribution plan can be done by the retirement fund through the amendments to its plan document. For the defined benefit plan, we got to go into law. So what this does is it takes a look at the investment criteria of the retirement fund's portfolio and seeks to diversify the ability of the fund to make investments in not only U.S. funds, but world and global funds. Now, since changes have been made to the defined benefit plan in terms of allowing prudent man rule, investment rule, for example, allowing for other investment vehicles that have occurred after the enactment of changes such as electronically traded funds, which is a collection of funds that are exchanged and traded as if they were stocks rather than investment trust funds. Now, collective investment funds can be investment vehicles. What has occurred is that the allocation of these funds and the investment of the retirement fund into these investment vehicles are set by statute. So certain percentages of the retirement fund's portfolio can be invested in world funds. As a subset of those world funds, when you invest in a subset of, let's say, real estate investment trusts as a world fund, then there's also, again, a criteria for how much percentage of the portfolio in this collective electronically traded fund family can be real estate investment trust investment vehicles versus dividend-paying stocks or growth stocks or value stocks. And so what this does is the investment consultants for the retirement fund have gone through the portfolio of the retirement fund and have looked at those limitations and where in the determination of these investment consultant professionals, those limitations have resulted in a concentration of investments and risk of investments, and limitation of that presents risk. They are proposing that we make some changes in the investment authorizations for these vehicles and allow the retirement fund to diversify those investments risk. At the hearing, of course, Mr. Speaker, the verbatim transcripts of the hearing is in the committee report, and I asked my colleagues to look at that. There's also a chart that outlines the peers of the different investment vehicles for public pension trusts, for private pension trusts, and it allows you to take a look at those limitations in terms of investments. And it then makes the appropriate change in the bill itself that allows the retirement fund and its board in the exercise of their fiduciary responsibility make these investment decisions with greater ability to diversify and thus protect the integrity of the trust and the fund and ensure that we are able to meet our obligations to the pensioners and the beneficiaries of this trust. And so, Mr. Speaker, once again, we are providing that those changes are made and that in this chapter, investment and management decisions respecting individual assets shall be evaluated not in isolation, because you can very easily cherry pick bad examples, but when you take a look at the overall picture, while you may lose 60% of your investment in one area, the overall average investment return may be very positive and very beneficial to the trust. So when we're looking at this and the retirement funds looking at it, they have to kind of take a look at that, not in isolation, but in the context of the fund's portfolio as a whole and as a part of the overall investment strategy, having risk and return objectives reasonably suited for the funds. That's one of the changes and the measurement criteria that we're allowing the board to make its investment decisions on. We're also saying that, rather than judging the investment of the funds, recently, of course, if you recall, there was a tiff between Governor Calvo and the retirement fund, where Governor Calvo, who wanted to make some changes to the retirement fund to give some cash flow relief to the general fund, was making this proposal, and the retirement board, rightly so, were saying, wait a minute, this is not the money of the general fund. This is the money of the beneficiaries of the fund, and we have to protect it. And so we're not going to just make that change. And Governor Calvo then started attacking the retirement board and saying, oh my God, we had these press releases, 60% loss in this, and there was all this back and forth over the radio in which we had individuals who we have funds older than them in the retirement fund investment portfolio trying to argue that the retirement board doesn't know what it's doing and therefore they should be replaced or and so forth, only because they didn't want to support Governor Calvo's efforts to raid the retirement fund. And there was nothing, that really was, they were attempting to raid the retirement fund to grant cash flow relief, basically borrow the money from the retirement fund rather than the bond market. And there was all these arguments there. And so we're saying enough of that, And so when you're looking at the fund, its historical investment performance, that it should be reviewed in light of the facts and the circumstances existing at the time of such a decision or action, and not in hindsight, because in hindsight, everybody's perfect. But it's not fair to attack people in hindsight, because even Governor Calvo never knew what the effect of those investment decisions would be. It also sets limits on the capital structure of the retirement fund, and also takes a look at the investment agents and its managers to manage the assets identified by the board upon the recommendation of its investment consultants and so forth, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues to take a look at this. We're not experts on this, but we certainly put a lot of time and effort into working with the retirement fund and their investment advisors and their attorneys on this, and we feel very comfortable after giving our due diligence on this that these changes will have a positive effect on the ability of the retirement fund to maximize its investments without providing or without placing any additional and undue risk on the assets of the trust and the financial viability of the retirement fund to meet its obligations to its trustees, to its beneficiaries rather, and the GovGuam worker who have worked all their lives and rightly have a right to depend on the trust upon their retirement, Mr. Speaker. So I thank my colleagues, and once again, I ask my colleagues for their favorable consideration on this bill.
Thank you very much. I saw Senator Duenas' hand go up. Any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? Senator Nicholas. Any other senator after Senator Duenas and Senator Nicholas? All right. Thank you. Senator Duenas.
Mr. Speaker. on the opportunity to rise in support of Bill 170-32. Notwithstanding some of the descriptions by the retiring speaker, I want to clarify my position in supporting this legislation. You know, those are different arguments. But, Mr. Speaker, several years ago, I had the opportunity to attend a conference hosted by the Retirement Fund as a fiduciary responsibility, really, that was issued in terms of what directors were facing in assembling budgets that included retirement benefits. And the prudent man model was discussed. And there was a discussion that future legislation would need to be passed in order to allow the retirement board to exercise more abilities outside of its current ability to evaluate its investments and strengthen the fund. I think this legislation certainly does that, Mr. Speaker. The two things that strike me in terms of what we have met on several occasions in the last several years, and certainly within this term when we had a briefing, Mr. Speaker, which you were in attendance with, is the unfunded liability. And the fact of the matter that stretching outward, this is something that is not going to be able to be ignored. And so that has a coupling effect. One is, of course, the responsibility and what it means in terms of actuarial and how much benefits and the like have to be paid in order to keep that under control and manage it. And the other major obstacle it presents, and many states will be dealing with this, whether or not it actually will be tagged to the overall debt service of any government. So those are down the road issues, but nonetheless, this is forward thinking in terms of the opportunity to diversify and handle that situation. As was mentioned, the Retirement Board and its fiduciaries have made representations that really, by and large, the current return rate is relatively stable and somewhat comparable, if not highly comparable and competitive with other markets. I guess in closing, Mr. Speaker, the other opportunity that I see, hopefully, and with certain principles put in place and investment opportunities for the retirement fund, which rightly so, you know, has to remain intact, and with the experts and professionals that are there to ensure its future. The one other opportunity, hopefully, Mr. Speaker, as better investment opportunities open up and we are explored, is that we also know that down the road is, and actually not even that far down the road right now, with the change of the DB and DC plan, we have situations whereby current retirees that are now in the new plan are experiencing, exhausting the extent of their resources which they built up in their retirement, probably sometimes 5 years or less. So there are a number of things that this government is going to have to do in its contractual obligation with the folks in the public sector that it's brought on board and made that commitment to throughout their employment. So any tool that we can put in the toolbox, Mr. Speaker, as far as I see, is certainly another tool to ensure that we can protect the viability and perhaps extend a hybrid benefits at some point someday, knowing that regardless, those folks will end up on some sort of benefit program perhaps, maybe because of their age and inability to work again, having exhausted under new opportunities, investment issues. So we've got a number of things to do, a big job ahead of us, but like any big job, when you come to the job site, if you have tools in your toolbox, you can tackle it. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a very fair proposal, and I look forward to the debate by my colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator Duenas. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I always very much appreciate the hard work of the author of this legislation. He very methodically and effectively goes into complicated matters and does a very, very good job of addressing a lot of the concerns and making sure that our laws are updated to reflect the current times and what we need to be able to make available for our government and our people. In this case, with the retirement fund, there are many new provisions in here that are going to help modernize the investment flexibility of the fund so that they'll be able to take advantage of various investment vehicles that have been created over the last several years that are available to the general public, but because of the lack of provision within the law are limited a great deal to our retirement fund. And what we want to do most of all for our retirement fund is to provide them with as much flexibility to pursue the kind of returns that are needed in order to make sure that we're meeting our goals and potentially even cutting down on some of the unfunded liabilities by making up for it in terms of growth. I do have a handful of amendments that I would like to proffer, Mr. Speaker, and I'll go ahead and go through them one by one. First, on page 7, line 13, this section here, section C, references Tier 1 capital for banks that are operating as custodians to the fund, and it limits it to $1 billion. That's a fair limitation, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to include, after the $1 billion, new language that reads, in any rolling 12-month period. And that's just so that, you know, sometimes when I was working at Bank of Guam, we actually crossed the $1 billion threshold while I was there, but it fluctuates up and down once you reach that threshold, depending on what the deposits are during the day. And the reality is that deposits can fluctuate depending on what the interest rate environment is, what competitors are doing. And so by adding the language in any rolling 12-month period, we won't be creating a situation where somebody may have qualified at $1 billion and then next month it drops down to $950 million. So just rolling it out over a 12-month period would allow for the flexibility for that provision to be enforceable.
On the first St. Nicholas amendment, any senator wish to be heard on it? Hearing no objection. Your next amendment, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Staying within that theme, I would like to go to page 8, line 25. And after $1 billion, this is in reference to the investment agents, whoever the investment advisors are for the fund. Again, adding the same language in any rolling 12-month period.
On that amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any objection?
Similar, again, Mr. Speaker, on page 9, line 3, $1 billion in any rolling 12-month period.
Okay. Anyone wish to be heard? If not, no objection.
Again, on line 9, Mr. Speaker, in any rolling 12-month period after $1 billion is referenced there.
No objection.
And on page 10, Mr. Speaker, line 20,
Okay.
these are the same prevent deposits. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to go into some other items that I found of interest. Let me try and dispose of them as the ones that would be the easiest first. On page 8, line 20, this section here, section 4, is part of the provisions that limits who may be engaged as an investment agent for the retirement fund. And on page 4, on page 8, line 18 through 20, item number 4, it reads, such person, firm, or corporation is registered as an investment advisor under the laws of the United States of America as from time to time in effect. I would like to add language that would remove the semicolon, and after the word and reads, is in good standing with the Financial Industry National Regulatory Authority and the Securities and Exchange Commission on a continuous and ongoing basis.
Can we get that in writing for the
I can
clerks?
provide it in writing, Mr. Speaker. What
Right.
this amendment will do is these two bodies are the primary regulatory bodies for investment advisors within the United States. And you have to be in good standing with them, and if you're not, you can have actual complaints filed against you. You can be adjudicated. You can have, what's the word? There are settlements that can take place within these regulatory authorities that can allow you to continue doing business, but you can get tagged for certain elements of malpractice. And so what I would like is for us to make sure that if we are going to be engaging investment counsel, that they are actually in good standing with these regulatory authorities, the FINRA and the SEC.
On that amendment, Any senator wish to be heard? Senator Pangilinan, any objection?
Another amendment I have, Mr. Speaker, would be on, excuse me, page 18, lines 1 to 6. Now, when I was going through this, and that's why I really appreciate the work of the author, because it allows me an opportunity to really review these things within a snapshot as opposed to the very encumbering section of the entire code. This particular section here on page 18 references the investments of common stock that the fund may be able to engage in. And this particular line here from 1 through 6 requires that any common stock investments have a history of paying cash dividends within the last 4 of the last 5 years, or alternatively in at least 7 of the last 10 fiscal years. And you know, when a company is paying cash dividends, as a former investment advisor, what that immediately tells me is that the company is returning capital to its shareholders. And underneath that, the underlying message there is that the company believes that returning capital to its shareholders is the most prudent use of that capital, as opposed to reinvesting that capital in itself. When we limit the ability of the fund to invest in individual common stocks to those that have paid out cash dividends, we're limiting it to those companies that are returning capital to shareholders, and those are usually regarded as what's called value companies. When we're looking for growth, oftentimes, growth companies do not pay cash dividends, but they have a lot of capital appreciation in terms of the growth of their stock price. For example, in the last 52 weeks, a company that we're probably all familiar with, Netflix, has grown from $74 a share to $329 a share. Massive growth. Hundreds upon hundreds of percent, but they do not pay a cash dividend. This language here would have prohibited the fund from being able to invest in those kind of growth companies. And so in the interest of the overall bill that's intended to allow for greater flexibility to the fund to take advantage of attractive investments, I find lines 1 through 6 to be a little too prohibitive in the ability of the fund to be able to go out there and actually find investments that could really have great returns. Dividend-paying stocks do appreciate. You will see growth in their shares, but that growth with respect to the industry that they're in is oftentimes lower versus their peers. Microsoft, for example, is now a dividend-paying stock, and their stock has pretty much fluctuated from $28 a share to $32 a share over the last 10 years. In the meantime, we have stocks like Apple that have grown exponentially without paying a dividend. We have companies like Netflix that have grown exponentially without a dividend. And so I would like for the body to consider striking lines 1 through 6 so that we can free up the fund to be able to invest in these kind of growth companies and not be limited only to those companies that are actually paying cash dividends.
So the amendment by Senator Nicholas is to strike lines 1 through 6. Any senator wish to be heard on it? Senator Pangilinan, any other senator wish to be heard?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree with the analysis provided by the author of the amendment. However, I do want to say that this limitation limits the investment in the dividend-paying stocks to 50% of investments in common stocks. So it does there are limitations in the investment ratios that the retirement fund can invest in common stocks. And so this limitation is on the common stock investment. If you remove this and this from the common stock investment, you still have the limitation, for example, that 25% of the total portfolio of the retirement fund has to be in dividend-paying stocks. And so we are allowing, I think that we want to, because of the current nature of the retirement fund with regards to its contribution level versus its payout level, requires that we supplement the payout of the fund in terms of the annuities to the beneficiaries with investment income. We can't support paying out the annuities without any investment income from the fund itself. So that's why we are actually, we've actually moved a little bit away, but we are, we had been a little bit heavily weighted in investments in dividend-paying stocks because we needed that cash to pay out the fund without depleting, overly depleting the corpus of the fund itself. And so striking this would remove that requirement, which may mean then that when it's time to pay out the annuities of the beneficiaries, we may be needing to liquidate more of the corpus of the fund, which then doesn't make it available for reinvestment, which then reduces the investment income of the fund. So I would oppose doing this only because we already have a limit and we allow of the total investment allowed in common stocks. And we have in the past changed the criteria for investments from dividend-paying stocks to allow greater, and this bill does that as well, allows greater investment of the fund's portfolio in the other investment criteria that the retirement funds consultants feel would maximize the return on the fund in its growth of the corpus of the fund outside of growth coming from the cash dividends that are paid to the fund. And so this limitation is only on those common stocks, and removing it, I think, may have an effect on the corpus of the fund with regards to liquidating fund assets necessary to meet the payout. Our contribution rate to the retirement fund on a monthly basis is less than the total annuities paid out on a monthly basis. And it is supplemented by the dividends of the dividend income limitation or the common stock dividend paying stock limitation under the common stock ratio that we have in terms of the total assets of the fund. So I understand exactly what he's saying, but I think we have solved that issue of allowing investments in Netflix or Google and such companies that are value stocks, that are growth stocks, and allows us to realize that capital appreciation there and increase the financial size of the fund and ensure that we're able to catch up with regards to the fund itself, reduce the unfunded liability, and build the investment corpus faster because of the greater growth allowed in investing in stocks such as Netflix and value stock criteria that the investment advisors work with the retirement fund. So I certainly understand what he's saying, but I think this section is existing statute, and it only limits that area for dividend common stocks, and still allows a significant portion of the retirement fund's other assets unallocated to common stock to be invested in value stocks that drive the growth versus the cash dividend. So I would oppose the amendment for that purpose because it's segmented to just the common stock limitation.
Thank you very much, Senator Pangilinan. Senator San Nicolas?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate what the retiring speaker talks about in terms of the need for cash flow being generated in the form of dividends to pay for the payouts of the retirement fund. Whenever you need to generate cash to make payments from the retirement fund, there are multiple ways of doing it. You either have cash generating instruments within the holdings of the fund that you then pass through to the annuities, the retirees, and their payments. Or you liquidate capital gains, you realize capital gains, and then you sell those stocks at a gain, and you pass that through on the annuity side. When I read this section of the law, it references common stock, which is all stocks, dividend-paying stocks, value stocks, growth stocks. And this specific language here excludes every single stock that does not pay a dividend. Just by reading this language here, if I were to look at the portfolio of the retirement fund, and if any of its common stock holdings were not paying dividends, then by law, they would be required to liquidate those positions and vacate them and move the money over into a dividend-paying stock. And dividend-paying stocks, they don't have the same growth historically as non-dividend paying stocks. The reason why a company does not pay a dividend is because they're saving all that money internally and reinvesting it in the growth of the company. And that's why with non-dividend paying stocks, we see that kind of exponential growth. While with dividend paying stocks, it's not as dramatic. I don't believe that removing this language will prevent the retirement fund from investing in dividend-paying stocks, because what we're not adding is language that says you may not invest in dividend-paying stocks. All we're doing is we're striking the language that says you can only invest in dividend-paying stocks. So even if we strike out lines 1 through 6, the fund can still invest in dividend-paying stocks if it so chooses. But because this language exists as it stands, every single common stock investment would have to have a history of paying dividends. And you know, there's other ways that the fund can also generate that recurring cash flow. Typically, when you're looking for a recurring cash stream in an investment, dividends are not necessarily the way to go unless you go for those really high yielding stocks, but then those present a whole new level of risk. If you're looking for cash flow, you typically invest the money into bonds or bond funds that have the various protections in place, plus the guaranteed stream of income over the life of the instrument. Dividend-paying stocks as a source of cash flow to pay for whatever obligations you have to pay for, there is a benefit to it, but it's only really valuable if you are a tax-paying entity. And that's because dividends are treated as a different class of taxable income when you file your income tax return. Dividends are taxed at, well, now they're taxed at 20%. They were taxed at only 15%, versus being taxed as ordinary income, which is what you'd get taxed at if you were investing in a bond. So from an investor's perspective, the only time that a dividend investment for cash flow purposes would be more attractive than a bond is if the tax benefit from that dividend investment would offset the yields that you'd be able to get otherwise in the bond market. But because the retirement fund does not have to concern itself with the taxes that are paid in the cash flow, the benefit of investing in dividend stocks is very muted. And ultimately, whenever you break out your asset allocation and you invest in different asset categories, your investment in stocks is primarily for growth. Income is a secondary factor. Again, it's mostly attractive if it's for the dividend as it relates to the tax benefit that comes with it. But absent that tax benefit, stocks are really a focus of growth. And so I would like to go ahead and pursue the idea of striking lines 1 through 6. Again, it does not preclude the retirement fund from selecting dividend-paying stocks, but it also, by striking these lines, does not require that they invest in dividend-paying stocks. So I would like to go ahead and proffer that amendment, and I guess we'll see where it goes, Mr. Speaker.
Is that an objection? Is there a way that you can include a provision to allow for value stock besides these two?
Once again, this amends one section of the retirement fund investment authorizations. So to take a look at this and say this is subject to 100% of the portfolio of the retirement fund is not correct, and that's what I'm saying. That there are limitations in terms of the allocation of the total investment portfolio in the investment of these different investment vehicles. And once again, when you strike this provision, then you can buy a stock that pays dividends only 1 year. And so the security of that dividend is, of course, if it's only paying, it may not pay the next year. So there has to be a history with regards to, once again, the regularness of that investment portfolio and the financial stability of the company as demonstrated by a record of paying dividends over a prolonger period of time than a single year or 2 or 3 years. So again, this limits it to this type of dividend stock in terms of this limitation is for that section of the portfolio that is allowable to be invested in common stocks. You have a portion of the portfolio that's invested in bonds. You have a portion of the portfolio that is segregated in the investment of common stocks to value stocks, dividend-paying stocks, preferred stock, etc., so that there are different ratios that are allowed under the overall general investment criteria of the retirement fund, and this section only speaks to the common stock limitation.
Thank you. There's been an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Do you have any further amendments?
A few, Mr. Speaker, if you can just give me a minute. I did have one final change that I would like to propose.
Please.
I'd first like to preface it by talking about a different section. We have a section here with regards to the custody of the retirement fund. And we have a section on page 7, section E, that reads, notwithstanding any of the above, any locally chartered bank may be a custodian of the retirement fund. And this section E is a very good section because what it does is, regardless of the mega players that are out there globally, we're still keeping the door open for our local companies to be able to get involved. And one of the things that I found, Mr. Speaker, as a former investment advisor, is the ability for local investment advisors to be able to be contracted to work with the retirement fund to offer their perspective of investment advice is very, very limited, because when we go down the provisions here on page 8, line number 7, it says no investment agent shall be engaged unless, and then it goes down this whole list here. And one of the list items is that the person or firm certifies in writing that they have assets in excess of $1 billion under management. We've now made an amendment that says in any rolling 12-month period. But ultimately what that means is you cannot be hired by the retirement fund to offer any kind of investment advice unless you have $1 billion under management. Now there's good sides to that, but there's also bad sides to that, Mr. Speaker. The good side to it is if you're a fund manager that has $1 billion in assets or more, chances are you're doing a darn good job because everybody wants to give their money to you. And you have a track record and etc. The flip side to it is that those really, really large investment firms, they have very, very high value clients, many of which have various priorities. And the retirement fund, with as much assets as it has, is a huge asset for this island. But with respect to where it might fall in terms of, I don't want to say priorities, but just in terms of how it measures up to all of the other clients that these kind of investment firms may have, our retirement fund could be, just one of hundreds. And so it could, there is a possibility that by limiting the advice that the retirement fund gets to only these very, very large funds, the attention to detail with respect to the particular interests of the fund might be getting lost in the overall picture of the asset manager. For example, if you're a very, very large investment firm, you have billions of dollars under management, and you have a holding within all of your different clients that, is across the board of all of your clients. It makes up a very, very significant holding with respect to all the individual accounts you have under your management. It gets very, very difficult to advise any individual client, you know what, you probably should sell that. Because if you were to advise one client that and not another, you run into all kinds of problems. Because then if you ever get audited, they'll ask the question, why were you telling client A to sell that, but you weren't telling client B to sell that? And so that's why sometimes we have what I've seen in the industry is a herd casualty, in that because these large firms are having so many of their clients holding the same thing, they have a very difficult time advising that they sell it, because you can actually see sell transactions have to be implemented across the board that could have a significant impact on the underlying holding, and also have a significant impact on the relationship of the firm. I mean, for example, if you're a large investment firm providing this kind of investment advice, you might also have been the firm that was the underwriter for that very company. There's all kinds of things that happen in the industry, Mr. Speaker, that you look at and you say, wow, that's a little muddy. It's not illegal, but it's a little muddy. But if you are the underwriter for a very, very large company who issues bonds on a regular basis, it becomes very, very difficult for you to do a wholesale recommendation to your clients and say, hey, you know what? Yeah, you probably should sell that stock. And that's why sometimes we see these 10, 20, 30% declines in underlying holdings or even in overall asset values, because there is no independent third-party advisor able to go in there and say, yeah, he's telling you to hold that, but I really think you should sell it. And so when we limit the investment advice that our fund is getting to only these very, very large firms, it does have the benefit of having these reputable large firms advising our fund, but it also has the disadvantage of limiting the view of the fund only to what those very, very large firms want you to see and want you to hear. And I believe that we have a lot of very, very good investment advisors here on Guam who can independently analyze investments and who aren't afraid to say, yeah, you know that very, very large company you're holding, you probably should sell that. Because they don't have the underwriting tie-ins, and they don't have the hundreds and hundreds of $100 million clients all holding the same thing that they got to go out and sell for all of them too. It becomes very, very specialized, and in the interest of the retirement fund, for us to be able to have our own local investment advisors able to be retained by the fund to give their perspective, to be able to look at the fund's holdings and say, yeah, you know, I'm local investment advisor A and I only manage $50 million, but none of my clients hold that investment, and here's why. And then from there, the retirement fund can look at their other investment managers and they can say, you know what, our local advisor is saying we should sell this. What do you think? And then all of a sudden, we're going to be getting more heads on the table, more eyes looking at the investments, and our local investment advisors can have the opportunity to be contracted with the retirement fund to be able to offer their perspective on the holdings. And I really think that might help in assessing the risk of the portfolio, in looking at all of the individual investments within the portfolio, and providing not only a third-party view independent of these large investment firms, but a local view. You know, a local view of a local investment advisor who really looks at the fund with a different set of lenses, because it's not just one client. It's not just a client in a long list of $100 million clients. It's our retirement fund. And so I would like for the body to consider an amendment that would have language similar to the one I read earlier with regards to bank custodies, but this time have it applied to our investment advisors, and give our investment advisors the opportunity to be able to be contracted by the fund. No guarantees. There's nothing compelling the fund to hire our local advisors. But if the fund does see that our local advisors may be worthwhile in having them hired out as independent consultants for the fund, I think that we should allow that in law. I think it would be a good thing, because none of our advisors locally within our local investment management community have $1 billion under management. I mean, if you're an investment advisor here on Guam, you're lucky to have 200, 300 million, 400 million even. Most have 10, 20, 30, 40 million dollars. But they do have that expertise and they do have that perspective. And I would like to open that up to the fund so that the fund can be able to avail itself of what our local investment advisors have to offer and be able to get that third-party perspective that might just free it from having to hold on to particular holdings that a large asset manager might be interested in holding on to for a variety of other reasons. So on page 8, line 25, I would like to add an amendment there, similar to that, to the other language regarding custodians, that reads, notwithstanding any of the above, all professionals domiciled in and licensed as investment advisors or investment advisor representatives within the territory of Guam, in good standing with FINRA and the SEC, shall be eligible for consideration to provide investment advisory services to the retirement fund. I'll provide that in writing, Mr. Speaker.
Please, Senator Pangilinan, did you wish to be heard? And then Senator Ada, and then Senator DeWayne, no? Senator Pangilinan, then Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, I don't disagree with what the good author of the amendment is trying to do, but I think it's in the wrong section. I think this, in my reading of this, we're talking about the investment agent. We're talking about the money manager. We're talking about the person we give $100, $200, $300 million of the retirement fund money to invest. I think when we're talking about the investment advisor, there is an investment advisor that is employed by the retirement fund to manage and review and analyze the performance of the investment agents. So we're talking about, you know, somebody who has the capital. If we give you $100 million and for somebody embezzles it from you, you got to be able to return that $100 million to the retirement fund. You got to have the capacity to bond yourself for $100 million or $50 million even at that. And so, again, I may be mistaken, but I certainly think in this case that I'm reading this correctly. So this limitation is not on the investment advisor. Because that is a separate professional service that is contracted by the retirement fund. And so what we have are the investment agents, and we may have 4 or 5 investment agents who then take the money that's given to them and they make the investments. They decide to buy Netflix instead of Google, or they decide to buy Corning instead of Dow, and so forth. And we have then our investment advisor who monitors the performance of the return of the management of that investment agent in terms of what its performance in terms of enhancing the investment return on that money that is handed over to them to make those investment decisions. So to make, like again, I said, I don't disagree with what is being attempted, but since we were making some of these changes in sections of the retirement fund bill, sometimes we kind of didn't see that part and so forth. So again, I'm not sure that this is the correct area to make this amendment, because this speaks to the financial strength of the investment agent, the financial strength and capacity to ensure that when something goes wrong, when these investment agents have the custody of the funds and the money of the retirement fund, that there's protection for the fund and its beneficiaries. And if you're going to hand over, you know, $50 million, and nothing against our local investors, but because our capital base is small, they don't manage $100 million in funds, or they don't have the capacity to maybe provide insurance for $100 million, just as, you know, should somebody embezzle the money, or should somebody do whatever that puts that capital at risk without the capacity to guarantee that when it's negligence or some other area in which there is culpability and the retirement fund must be whole, that they have the capacity to do so. And so I don't believe that this would be appropriate, this amendment would be appropriate here. And I'm not even sure where at this time, I've got to go back into the statute itself and look at it, where it speaks of the investment advisors versus investment agents. And so I would, at this time, oppose putting that amendment in this section of the statute until we clarify, if that would be appropriate and what the effect of putting that, relaxing that limitation, because, and I say relaxing, we're not really relaxing it because we're still requiring them to meet the same licensing requirements and so forth, but relaxing it in regards to the capacity that they have to guarantee that whatever is given to them in terms of custody of those funds would allow that the retirement fund will be made whole should something go wrong. Thank you, and this is Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Addo. You don't wish to speak? Thank you. Do I take that to be an objection, Senator Ben? Yes. Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just my perspective, Mr. Speaker. Having gone through the code, and it is a very expansive article. The section of investment advisors, I wasn't able to see what particularly was addressed within the law. I do know that basically with the way this language is written, we will never see any of our local investment advisors managing any of the assets of the retirement fund. And that's kind of sad. It's kind of sad because the only reason why a lot of our local investment advisors are in business is because they get the returns that their customers are expecting of them. And those kind of services and returns could be employed for the benefit of the retirement fund. The amendment would in no way compel the retirement fund to do business with these agents. It in no way would ameliorate the fiduciary responsibility of the fund to be able to do its due diligence on those particular agents that are local and say, you know what, yes, you're able to manage this amount, no, you're not able to manage that amount. Many investment advisors, if not all of them, because I know that in order to be an investment advisor, you need to be doing business with a prime broker who's going to be able to effectuate your transactions. And all of those brokers, those prime brokers, have what's called SIPC insurance, which is insurance protection against the event of you shutting down your business, you defaulting, you closing up shop. SIPC would kick in and guarantee your investments up to, I believe, and I'm a little rusty because it's been a couple years, but up to, I believe, $500,000 in assets under management. So if we were to open up the ability for our local agents to be able to manage money, and if the retirement fund were to be able to employ that capacity prudently under their fiduciary responsibility, and if they were concerned about whether or not they'd be able to get the money back in the event that the company were to close down, they could simply look at the investment agent and say, do you have SIPC insurance? Is it maintained? Is it ongoing? Okay, here's some money that you can manage as well for the benefit of the fund. So, those are the kind of things that I look at and I think about. And I look at it with respect to what was read about earlier with regards to having local banks be custodians. I came from the Bank of Guam. And it was only in the last several years that the Bank of Guam was able to surpass $1 billion in assets. If we had this provision in place, and if we did not open the door to allow local banks to be custodians, the Bank of Guam would have never had the opportunity to be a custodian. And that's that's important. I think it's important for our local institutions to be able to avail of our local expertise. And I understand the need for thresholds, and I understand the need for protections. I understand the need for fiduciary responsibility to be such that you're going to be able to say, you know what, we made the best decision with the investments, we made the best decisions for the retirees that depend on the returns of these funds. I don't believe in any way that opening it up to our local service providers would suggest that there would be an abandonment of that. And I really believe that a lot of our local investment professionals would be very excited about the opportunity to be able to contribute to the growth of the retirement fund. Let me tell you, one of the things that I've always loved when I was an investment advisor, Mr. Speaker, I always loved getting a client who used to be a client of a super large firm. I loved getting them in as a client because they weren't getting the attention that they wanted or deserved, or because they weren't satisfied with the returns they were getting. And I loved receiving them and outperforming and turning their entire perspective around with regards to the quality of investment services that our local providers can give, the quality of performance that our local professionals can deliver. And it really feels good. It feels really, really good to be able to take in a client who wasn't very, very happy with what was happening with their big, huge, gold-plated or solid gold firm, and have them come to a local provider and really get an awesome experience and a very satisfactory outcome. And I think that our retirement fund could benefit from that. In light of what was shared by Speaker Pangilinan, and in the interest of moving the bill forward, I would like to work with the author to see if we can figure out where we can stick that language in, and I'll go ahead and withdraw this amendment in this particular section.
Thank you very much. All right. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? The bill? Hearing none, Senator Ben.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that the discussion this morning for me, while it may have been dry for some, stimulating for me. And I think this old dog has just learned a couple of new tricks with regards to really the perspective that has been shared by my young colleague. I certainly appreciate, and I've always appreciated his perspective. And when he shares some of that expertise with the rest of us, I think it just makes for greater discussion and greater enlightenment, and certainly provides us an opportunity to develop a greater sense of comfort in the decision that we're going to make. I think that I'm even more confident after the discussions that we've shared this morning that some of the things, if not all of the things in here, have been, in my mind, much more fully developed, and certainly gives me a greater confidence in terms of moving forward in this. So I do want to thank my good colleague for his perspective, his amendments to the bill, which I thought were very positive, and just some of the additional information that I think we can all use as we move forward in carrying on our fiduciary responsibility to the retirement fund, its beneficiaries, in terms of passing the policies needed to give them the greater and the greatest opportunity to maximize the investment return on those funds and meet the guarantee of the benefits that we have made to our hardworking GovGuam employees when it comes time for them to leave the workforce and enjoy their retirement. And so I want to thank him very much for that. I'd like to also, before I close, then make an amendment that I add Senator Mike San Nicolas as the second co-sponsor on the bill. Thank you, and hope there's no objection to that motion.
Hearing no objection. On the motion to send the bill down, any objection? Thank you for everybody's cooperation. I know that has been a request to go back. 108, are you ready to move forward on? Whatever you, if you're ready, you're ready. If not, we're going to move on, okay?
No. Mr. Speaker, I was just asking for the motion, I guess, to withdraw the previous bill and then ask to substitute Bill 108-32 as further substituted on the floor, and it's the bill with the 2 asterisks, so I guess it would be to withdraw the bill that we were discussing last week.
All right, the motion is to withdraw the bill that's Bill 108 that's currently on the floor and to substitute it with the bill that has 2 asterisks on it. Any objection?
And then now, Mr. Speaker, we can move it to the 3rd reading, and I'll briefly discuss it.
Hearing no objection, please.
Cesar Masi, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill is substituted, seeks to assist the Guam Environmental Protection Agency to successfully implement the Guam Beverage Container Recycling Act of 2010. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that over the course of the last year and a half, Guam Environmental Protection Agency, their legal counsel, as well as my own, U.S. EPA Region 9, we have reviewed the best practices in other jurisdictions currently implementing successful bottle bills, and we've also looked at Hawaii and California. As I noted last week, I want to say that together, the stakeholders, we have stakeholders have identified certain portions of the Guam statute that could be amended in order to address those lessons learned in those jurisdictions. And we've agreed that in order for the Guam Environmental Protection Agency to be as successful as possible in its own process of promulgating the rules and regs, the statute itself should be amended. One of the major amendments in this bill makes to the statute is to move Guam out of the Hawaii scheme of fixed deposit beverage containers fees and move it into the California's more flexible fee setting system. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that although this bill makes a number of specific smaller changes, the main feature of this bill is to bring Guam's statute in line with those identified as best practices. This, if a forward-looking and long-term way, is to ensure Guam's EPA's successful implementation of the law. And once we pass this bill, then Guam EPA will work to complete the rules and regs, and in turn, the military has committed to coming to the table to execute the MOU called for in the statute and implementation of this law that we've been working for the last, I'd like to say, since the 27th Guam Legislature will finally get to be moved forward. So we had a lot of discussion last week on the previous bill that was withdrawn, and all the amendments were made. We talked to legal counsels, and this is the new substituted version. So, Mr. Speaker, I really hope my colleagues will help support this effort and move forward. So we do have members, again, of Guam EPA here, and my staff is ready to, and myself, ready to answer any questions regarding this move. Santa Masi.
Any senator wish to be heard on Bill 108? I see, Senator Limtiaco and then Senator Respicio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the author would kindly yield, just because I've seen, I don't know how many iterations of this bill, I'm really trying to understand what the newly substituted Bill 108, what are the differences so that we can at least go through it and just understand what the changes were. And then I have several other questions to ask as well.
If you can look at the pages, Mr. Speaker, on page 1, we...
Why don't we do this? Let's get, if you're going to substitute it, you're substituting it, let's pass and mark all the amendments that you're making so everybody understands that their amendments that they asked for are included in this bill. is that sufficient for your?
Yeah, but there exists strike-throughs and underlines in the previously substituted bill. So where's the differentiation between the two substituted bills? How am I to determine which underline and strikeouts are relevant to the previous substituted bill and this substituted bill? So I can understand what the changes were in the I think it's the second substituted bill. Is there a way for me to differentiate that between the previously substituted bill strikeouts and underlines?
We're going to set this to the side. Highlight the new amendments. Senator Uggan, 145.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for the placement of Bill 145 as substituted into third reading. This is legislation that was previously discussed last week with regards to the naming of the park in Molesto, and there was a request by a member of this August body to withhold sending it down to the third reading for purposes of possibly coming up with additional amendments. But my understanding is that at this time he's going to withhold any additional amendments to this legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for the placement third reading. I believe discussion may have been completed as of as of Friday. But I'd like to move for just one additional amendment, please, Mr. Speaker, for your consideration that the good chair that had oversight over this legislation, who is Senator Tina Barnes, that she be added as an additional co-sponsor to this amendment and then move forward to placement in third reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I believe there's senators that wish to speak on the bill. Senator Pangilinan? You're done. Senator Rodriguez?
Okay.
You wish to be heard on this bill?
Not a problem. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right, on the motion to place 145 in third. No objection. Do you want to do your trademark while I'm up here? No. Senator Rodriguez, Senator, we received your report on 160. Do you wish to do 160 first or 169? I don't have that. 189? No. You're throwing off my... $160.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 160 to the third reading and be allowed to briefly discuss it.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bill 160 is an act to adopt the rules of procedure for the Government of Guam Health Insurance Negotiating Team and the conduct of the annual solicitation of health insurance coverage for Government of Guam active employees, retirees, and their dependents. Madam Speaker, on July 19th of this year, the Government of Guam Health Insurance Negotiating Team submitted the proposed rules and rules of procedures to the legislature. This rules and regs, Madam Speaker, has not been promulgated, has not been put into place since the enactment of the requirement in February of 1998. This provision was intended to provide for the orderly and equitable process by which the government's negotiating team shall annually seek to acquire health care insurance coverage. This mandate has not been complied with for about 14 years, Madam Speaker. As we are well aware, the annual process for the solicitation, receipt, review, and contract award for health insurance coverage for fiscal year 2013 was again conducted without the formal adoption of any rules of procedure. And what ultimately resulted was the filing of several protests and the rollover of the FY 2012 contract into FY 2013. A major flaw in the process, as was stated in the protest filed, was the failure of the government's negotiating team to duly promulgate and adopt the mandatory rules of procedure pursuant to which they would conduct the process. This was the first time this issue arose, and many would argue it would not have had the rules been in place. Now, once again, Madam Speaker, the annual process for the FY 2014 contract year was conducted without the formal final adoption of the rules of procedure. However, what happened this time was that the negotiating team conducted the process under interim rules of procedures, pending any formal legislative action on the proposed rules submitted. While not strictly pursuant to rules of procedures duly promulgated and completed through the administrative adjudication law process, it has nonetheless resulted in the award of 3 non-exclusive contracts without any protest being filed, and the strict adherence by the negotiating team to the interim rules at least resulted in the process free of protests. I would like to state for the record, Madam Speaker, that I have on numerous occasions pushed for the completion of the process prior to the FY 2014 solicitation and award process. However, notwithstanding notwithstanding my efforts, the negotiating team, pursuant to adopted motions, did nonetheless choose to proceed under the interim rules of procedure. That being the case, we are where we are at today, and that is it, and at least for this year. This is, after all, an executive branch function, and while extremely beneficial, the legislative seats on the team are non-voting. Taken at face value, the negotiating team, assisted by their legal counsel, went through a deliberative process, carefully ensuring each item in the rules duly reflected the statutory mandates and took into consideration the testimonies that were submitted. The FY 2014 process, followed pursuant to the proposed rules of procedure, has survived its initial tests, at least insofar as no protests were filed, and we now have 3 providing coverages. This must not, however, be the only criteria by which we measure the appropriateness of the proposed rules. That responsibility falls within the purview of the legislature, Madam Speaker. Bill 160 is an act to adopt the rules of procedures for the government of Guam health insurance negotiating team in their annual solicitation of health insurance coverage. This legislation that is sorely needed to be finalized now by this body as we move forward with the process of acquiring a new contract for fiscal year 2015. And so, Madam Speaker, as I stated earlier, it hasn't been put into place for the past 14 years. But now that we have this in front of us, I think it's imperative that we move forward and adopt it, so that the future process of negotiating a contract would have a set of rules that is followed and is adopted by this body. So again, thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
You're welcome, Senator. On the motion, is anyone who would like to speak? Speaker Pangilinan, you recognize.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to rise in support of placing these rules and regulations into effect. And I do want to commend the negotiating team and the work of the Attorney General's office and their consultants in working through the laborious process of trying to ensure that the system flows smoothly and that confidence is restored in the procurement process for health insurance. As you know, Madam Speaker, in the previous years, the health insurance process was mired in protests, and basically because the rules and regulations were not in place, we were operating on what some understood to be the process, what somebody said was the process, and so there were at times when they had to kind of fly by the seat of their pants with regards to how do we handle this situation, how do we handle that situation. And I think that this, even though it's quite not as extensive, the meat of the whole issue will come in the request for proposal that must be adopted by the negotiating team. And in there is where you have the more nuts and bolts and the technical aspects of it. But this ensures that those that are members know what their responsibilities are and such, so that we can then compare what is authorized under the rules and the statute, the rules and regulations, and the request for proposal, and they all must be consistent with each other, and therefore provide the opportunity for those that are interested in doing business with the government of Guam in health insurance, that they will be treated fairly, openly, and honestly. And I think that we have seen decisions that are made that quite frankly have not been in the best interest of the people of Guam, not been in the best interest of the government of Guam, and not be in the best interest of the employees who we have a responsibility to provide health insurance services to them as responsible employers here on Guam. So, Madam Speaker, I do want to rise in support of this legislation. I do want to say that one of the things that has assisted the the negotiating team with regards to clarifying some of the nuances that have occurred in the discussions that occur is the fact that the meetings are recorded, so that whenever there is any question as to what did we mean by this, or who said what, or did we really do this, they have the ability to go back, review the tapes, and clarify then based on the public record and the record to ensure then that what was decided is actually what will be implemented. And so I'm not sure where I would put that, Madam Speaker. So not only is it, I think, important that the proceedings of the negotiating team itself be recorded, the negotiating team places a lot of confidence and depends quite a bit on the expertise of the actuarial firm or the consultant firm that it employs. And in a large portion of the negotiation process and the review process, the consultants communicate independently with the proposers, both pre-solicitation, post-submission, and post-opening of the bids. They communicate independent of the negotiating team. And I think it's very important that those communication should also be recorded. And so I would just like to add a new section, or the appropriate section here, that would require then that communications regarding the submission, award, and evaluation of the proposals submitted by health insurance wishing to participate in the Gulf Guam health insurance, that they be recorded as well. And that would be to add a new section 10 and then renumber the later sections. And it will be communications by offerers and subcontractors. Unsolicited communications by offerers and subcontractors by phone, mobile phone, email, or any other mode of delivery about any facet of RFP prior to negotiations is prohibited and shall result in the disqualification of the proposals of any offending offerer. Prior to disqualification, the negotiating team shall request the Attorney General's office to conduct an investigation to verify the veracity of such communication. So when you have these unauthorized communications occurring, I think it's very important that we don't allow that, because advantages can be built in for everybody else. That's why you have solicitation conference, pre-bid conference, post-bid conference, et cetera, and so we need to limit the communications that occur so that everybody's being told, knows what everybody's being told, and everybody's being told the same thing. And so that would be to add that new section.
That's a very long
Yes, I have it written up.
And can you just read it one more time?
Yes.
Does anyone have any concerns? Would you like to see a copy? Okay, the Senator, we'll take a brief recess so we can have copies made. Thank you.
You had a chance to review the amendment proposed by Senator Pangilinan. Anybody wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The second amendment I have is right below that. It would be recording of meetings. It will be added to the current section 15, a new A to read recording of meetings. All meetings between the negotiating team's consultants and any offers shall be recorded and made available to members of the negotiating team upon request.
On that amendment, Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If the sponsor of the amendment can just yield. I guess the only question I have, first and foremost, I think that openness in this entire process and transparency should be the norm. And the provision that is being proposed would lead in that direction. The only question I have is during the course of any negotiation, whether proprietary information will be part and parcel of that particular discussion. Because obviously some businesses in terms of releasing some of the proprietary information, which really it would allow for the competition to acknowledge some of their in-depth finances as well as the customer base and whatnot. So that's a question I have. If the good speaker, I believe that he understands exactly where I'm coming from. I mean, there have been some legislation that have been passed where in fact businesses are given the opportunity to retain proprietary information per that particular business, but not necessarily as part of a negotiation. So I just wanted to understand the implications of this, whether in fact business proprietary information other than the part of the negotiation would be part of the discussion, because the way this reads, it means that everything that is discussed in that negotiation aspect would be releasable to the public. And I certainly endorse that concept, and I'm just wondering whether in fact some part of the negotiation would include business proprietary information.
Do you yield, Senator?
Yes. No, the information is to be made available to the negotiating team, not to the public. So this is information that is contained in the packet. So when they have a meeting between the consultant and the offerer, the results of that meeting or the conducting of that meeting and the proceedings of that meeting shall be available to the negotiating team, so that the negotiating team is privy to all this information already. But when meetings occur between the consultants and the offerers and the negotiating team is not part of that meeting, then whatever occurs at that meeting shall be made available to the negotiating team. So it does not impact the confidentiality aspect that Senator Uggan is concerned about with regards to releasing that. And then, of course, after the completion of the procurement process, then the procurement record is open and subject to public inspection, with still the provision that proprietary information that is so designated in the offer submitted remains even private after that and proprietary.
Does that answer your question, Senator Uggan?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the clarification.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Pangilinan amendment? Hearing none. Any other amendment, Senator Pangilinan?
Yes, one more amendment, Mr. Speaker, would be to add the following sentence to section 4 to read, copies of all correspondence between the negotiating team and the judiciary or the governor shall also be transmitted to the legislature. Again, this just clarifies it. We're saying that both the governor and the legislature and the judiciary, as equal branches of government, are outside the scope of the negotiating team. But there comes a time when correspondence needs to be sent to the governor, and I'm saying that the governor and the legislature shall stand in the same place with regards to the right to receive that information.
On that amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any objection to the amendment? Hearing none.
And one final amendment, Mr. Speaker, on page 9 of the bill, line 2, where it says the agenda shall be confirmed by the negotiating team at the start of a meeting. I just want to add, strike the word confirmed and just put the agenda shall be adopted or amended by the negotiating team at the start of a meeting.
on that amendment? Any senator wish to be heard? Any objection to the amendment? Hearing none.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Sidus Masi.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just, on page 9, I notice, well, the negotiating team is made up of 9 voting members. And on page 9, on section 7, where it talks about quorum, it requires 7 voting members to establish quorum. And I'm just curious as to why the number 7 as opposed to, normally it would be like in this case for a 9-member board, the quorum would be 5. And the same way you'll see there in paragraph 8 that a decision can be made by if at least 5 votes there's at least 5 affirming votes. So I'm fine with that, but I'm questioning, and maybe the author would yield, why is 7 voting members the required number for quorum?
Either one of you want to yield?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to check, but I believe it's only there's 9 members of the team, but 2 of them are ex officio, non-voting
No.
members.
There's 9 voting and 2 non-voting.
I think it's just a higher threshold for the meetings. I mean, it's not one of those that you can conduct without people. So it would seem to me that, to the benefit of the Department of Administration, they're demanding that everybody attend meetings as opposed to being able to have meetings without a larger number of the negotiating team in attendance, which I think is an excellent idea. But it would take a majority to be able to approve of the decision. But still, having more people attend the meeting is...
I have no problem with 7 as a quorum. I'm just curious as to why.
That was their decision, and I think it's to their benefit that they have a higher threshold.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the motion? On the main motion? If not, Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleagues for, especially Senator Pangilinan for his amendments. However, I'd just like to, before I close out, see if we could amend one of the amendments that were made on Section 10. It says here, unsolicited communication by offers and subcontractors by phone, mobile phone, email, or any other mode of delivery about any facet of the RFP prior to negotiation is prohibited and shall result in disqualification. And then it says, prior to disqualification, the negotiating team shall request the Attorney General's office to conduct an investigation to verify the veracity of such communication. And what I'd like to do is amend shall to may. And so, yes, it's prohibited, and they may be disqualified. And so they may be disqualified, and prior to that disqualification, the negotiating team asks the Attorney Generals to investigate the matter. And I'd like to add after communication, add and shall provide its recommendations to the negotiating team for further action. And so it's not an automatic disqualification. I mean, that's the way it appears that the good senator is trying to make it seem, is that it's prohibited, but it's not automatic disqualification. You still have to go through a process within, a process within the team. And so if we could, I'd just like to add those amendments to that amendment.
Any objection? No. Hearing no objection.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so now I ask that be placed on a 3rd reading.
Any objection? Hearing none. Madam Speaker, you're recognized on Bill 156.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to make a motion to place Bill 156-32 as introduced to the 3rd reading file, and if I can briefly describe what the bill is about.
Hearing no objection, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In response to growing concerns on local intellectual property rights and trademarks, yourself, Senator Munya Barnes, and Senator Duenas, and I have decided then to create this legislation, which is an act to create a Guam Trademark Commission for the development of a cultural trademark statute for the protection and preservation of Guam's Chamorro cultural arts. Currently, local businesses or individuals who wish to protect their intellectual property rights, trademarks, and copyrights under the U.S. Trademark Statute must file with the U.S. Federal Trademark and Patent Office, a process that can take as much as 8 months, depending on the number of applications the U.S. Copyright Office receives at the time of submission. Guam has an older statute in place that permits a person or company to file locally and receive a certificate of registration for its products or labels. However, this statute needs to be revisited to provide more comprehensive guidelines and protection. A new trademark statute for Guam will tighten up our existing laws related to copyright, trademarks, and intellectual property rights, and offer better protection to those businesses or individuals that wish to file locally and will bridge the filings in line with federal requirements. So Bill 156 would impanel an 11-member commission made up of the legislative chairperson with oversight over cultural affairs, as well as various government agency heads from the Department of Revenue and Taxation, Guam Economic Development Authority, Guam Council on the Arts and Humanities, Department of Chamorro Affairs, Guam Visitors Bureau, the Attorney General's Office, and several appointed individuals and stakeholders in the industry to develop and propose legislation for a comprehensive Guam trademark law. The Commission is also mandated to assist in the creation of a cultural certification trademark program titled the Guam Cultural Trademark Act that will define, protect, and license Chamorro cultural arts manufactured or produced in Guam. Some states with indigenous cultures like Hawaii and Alaska have been working for years towards implementing a cultural trademark. These statutes struggle with protecting their native cultural arts and practices because they're essentially being lost as cheap imitation products flood their markets. There's been a progressive movement in Guam's local art scene and entrepreneurs from the island community who are engaged in a revitalization of our culture through their artwork, handcrafted gift items, carvings, jewelry making, t-shirt designs, music, dance, film, paintings, photography, and other locally made products. This bill is the first step in ensuring that these unique and native cultural works of our local artists are better protected. The recently revamped Guam Product Seal Program, administered by the Guam Economic Development Authority, offers some protection to those products made in Guam through distinctive labeling. However, even with the strict guidelines of the use of the words Guam or Chamorro, many companies remain in non-compliance. Some would simply use a village name as Tuman, or even the words Hafaday, or another distinctive Guam characteristic or Chamorro icon on their products. Guam is the host of the upcoming 12th Annual Festival of Pacific Arts, better known as FESPAC, in 2016. Some 27 Pacific Island nations and territories with over 2,500 performers, artists, and cultural practitioners, in addition to the thousands of visitors from Asia and festival followers, are expected to attend. The FESPAC Organizing Committee has been discussing the importance of implementing a more comprehensive cultural trademark law prior to the festival. The measure is expected to address this concern. The Commission, once it's established with this legislation, shall then submit proposed legislation after its study for these rights and trademark to the legislature no later than 180 calendar days from the date of this enactment, and shall be subject to legislative approval and perform all functions necessary to effectuate the mission of the Commission. And lastly, if I may add, is that the first meeting of the Guam Trademarks Commission, once it's enacted then, shall take place no later than 20 days after enactment. So with that, Mr. Speaker, and I'm hoping my colleagues will find it, of course, in their heart to support this legislation that will once, hopefully, that with the enactment of this commission, and then, of course, the creation of legislation then to protect the cultural trademarks of our Chamorro cultural arts. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Any senator wish to be heard on the bill? Senator Ben.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly believe that this bill will ensure that we put some integrity into the culture of Guam and the representations that are made by our community and those who hold themselves out to have the best interests of protecting, preserving, identifying, and promoting the native culture of Guam and our people. One of the concerns I have, though, Mr. Speaker, is that on Section K, is that we have gone through and set up the membership, and then we add under Section K where on page 8, yes, where we now then allow the chairperson in the committee to include additional public or private sector members to serve on subcommittees or elect them as committee members, provided they possess significant background knowledge, experience with locally produced products, and the commission may prescribe special procedures for their participation. I just kind of feel a little uneasy about that latitude that would then be given to the chairperson of the commission. And so in that respect, I would, make a consideration that we just strike that I think if we need to add more members, I mean, this is already quite a large commission in terms of the number of members and the broad spectrum of the representation. And so because of that, I think that to provide that additional flexibility may be a little bit more expansive than we would want to consider.
On that motion to strike that power, any objection?
Yeah.
Senator Agron, on that motion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the kind mover of the amendment if he would consider providing the flexibility for subcommittees, because they're not direct appointees to serve as members of the large committee? So, because obviously in situations like this, we always want to branch out and be more inclusive in terms of allowing other professionals and other experts in the community to contribute to the process. So rather than deleting the entire section, that the chairperson may include additional public or private sector members to serve on subcommittees, and delete or elect them as committee members. That particular provision I can consent to, and I certainly have absolutely no questions with regards to that. But allowing for the overall committee to assign or to select subcommittee chairpersons so that they can move in a particular direction and address certain issues, I think it's just being more inclusive with the overall process. So I would like to ask the sponsor of the amendment to consider that. If not, I still have no objection on his amendment. Thank you.
Since he has no objections on the amendment, I respectfully decline to consider that.
Okay. So it's strike K. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I understand, of course, where the previous or the mover of the amendment is coming from, but and maybe because he has the chairperson, I know that currently it would be you and I have no qualms at all in terms of your decision. But in the future, we don't know. But more importantly is that there are individuals, of course, out there, and if you look at the membership, they're not necessarily, that's why we put some artisans in here, but, some of the members may not have that background or knowledge or experience in all of these things, and you're going to need some of these experts there. That's why this was crafted, to have them serve on subcommittees to bring in these individuals. And I think there might be a way maybe to do this, that rather than it just being the chairperson alone, but rather that to make this decision, but of course the body will make that decision. And then what it is that to have them, allow them to be part of a subcommittee only because they bring a wealth of information and knowledge and expertise to the group, and that's the whole purpose of this. So I don't know if the mover of the amendment is hearing. And
The chair will call for lunch at this point.
All right, thank you very much then.